Emerging national culture, but those regional differences that we saw emerge early on in English colonies, those persist even through the Federalist era. Let's talk first about that emerging national culture. Benjamin West is the first American artist to gain any sort of prominence, any sort of respect in Europe. And he did so with this painting we see here, The Death of General Wolfe, which he completed in 1770, about, I believe, a conflict in the French and Indian War. Now, West remained in Europe. For his time, that's where an important artist wanted to do his work. The same was true of John Copley, most famous for this portrait of Samuel Adams that he completed in 1771. He also remained in Europe. However, Gilbert Stuart, who studied with both of those guys, studied in Europe but then returned to the United States and is most famous for this portrait of George Washington, which he completed in 1792. Another American artist who returned to the United States as well, so we're seeing a shift here, was Charles Willson Peale. He created wartime propaganda during the American Revolution. He painted patriot leaders, like his portrait of George Washington here in the background. Now that's a self-portrait of him there in the lower right, and he's pulling back the curtain to his museum. He creates one of the first U.S. museums in Philadelphia, and it really began as a public gallery of revolutionary heroes, and you can see some of the busts there on the right. Also important visual artist of the time was John Trumbull, who himself served as a soldier during the Revolutionary War and painted in a very historical, romantic style. He became famous for this picture, the Battle of Bunker Hill, and became known as the painter of the Revolution. He was so widely respected and well known that he was commissioned to reproduce 4 of his paintings that now hang in the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol. Moving on from visual arts, let's take a look at architecture. And if we're going to talk about architecture in the Revolutionary period, in the Federalist period, we should probably talk about the most significant architectural achievement of the time, Washington, D.C., the design of which and the layout of which was first conceived by this man, Pierre-Charles L'Enfant, a French engineer who moved to the United States, served as an officer in the Revolutionary War. And he designed Washington, D.C. as a planned city for the people. You can see some of those Republican, little r, ideals reflected in the design of the city. For example, major public buildings like the Capitol and the White House are linked with these diagonal avenues that you can see crisscrossing the grid setup of the city. It's like all the buildings are in sight of each other. It makes me think of the idea of checks and balances, as you can clearly see the Capitol building from the White House and vice versa. Because there is a clear line of sight down that avenue that connects the two. You can also see this for the people design in the National Mall, what he called the Grand Mall, which would be a vast garden, but be lined with public museums and public academies and public assembly halls right in the capital of the United States. While we're talking about Washington, D.C., we should probably note that the survey of the land was completed with the assistance of probably America's first African-American mathematician, Benjamin Banneker. Architecture at this time was heavily influenced by Roman architecture. It's what makes the architecture of the Federalist period part of a neoclassical movement. And that's not surprising, because just as Thomas Jefferson and George Washington wanted our new government system to embody the Greek and Roman ideals of democracy and republicanism, they wanted that reflected in the architecture that was created. They wanted the architecture, the actual buildings, to embody or reflect some of those Greek and Roman ideas. So the architecture of this time period, of the time period of the Revolution and immediately after, is known as Federal style architecture. It's a kind of bridge between the Georgian or colonial style of architecture that we see up in the upper left and the Greek Revival style of architecture, which comes later in the 1800s. And here we can really see the profound difference between the Federal style on the top and the Greek Revival style on the bottom. This is the same house. Now, it was redone by the original builder's son later. So on the bottom, you have the Greek Revival style. And notice it's a little bit more showy. It's a little bit more ostentatious. The Federalist style up on the top is very understated. If there's any decoration, it's normally confined to the porch or the entryway. And the columns and the molding found on the structure are going to be more narrow and rather simple compared to some other architectural styles, the Georgian that came before and the Greek Revival, which comes later. We can see this Federalist or federal style of architecture in the White House and in the U.S. Capitol building. And we can see it throughout New England and even throughout the nation as a result of this man, Asher Benjamin, who writes the first American architecture pattern book. What this was a book that was published and could be purchased around the country, and carpenters and builders and even other architects could look through these books to copy the column style, the molding style, the looks and flourishes that really defined the federal style of architecture. We see that in row houses and townhouses in New York City and Philadelphia, seen here in the picture. And notice how they're very modest in scale. They're very restrained in their ornamentation. And we can see that in federal style houses around the country as well. This is your traditional federal style house. Notice the perfectly centered door, the almost cube-like shape of the house, the 2.5 floors of windows, the 6x6 windows, and the columns, but very understated and very focused with the ornamentation at the entrance. Finally, if we're talking about national culture, we should talk about literature. And there is an explosion of American literature in this federal era. And that's a result of having a very literate public. 90% of the people in New England, and even out on the frontier, 2 out of every 3 people on the frontier in America could read. As a result, you have almost 100 newspapers in the country by the time the Constitution is ratified. And there existed an infrastructure to supply this literate public. There were bookstores throughout urban areas, towns, and cities. And then in more rural areas, in the back countries of America, there were what were called book peddlers, guys like this who traveled from village to village, from door to door, selling books, normally a paperback style or a pamphlet or a tract. But what this did was bring literature to almost all Americans. And it's not surprising that in this time period of the American Revolution, immediately before and after, that political books were the best sellers. That's Thomas Paine there in the back. He's covered up by all of his bestsellers. Not only did he write Common Sense and The American Crisis, he then went on to write Rights of Man, which was his interpretation and account of part of the French Revolution, and then wrote Age of Reason, which was an attack on organized religion. Another important book of the era was Noah Webster's American Spelling Bee, which simplified spelling, calling the King's English overly complicated and kind of revealing aristocratic tendencies. So Webster wanted to simplify American English with things like dropping the extra U in the word color. Another popular type of literature at this time surrounded that developing American character or American identity or American personality. For example, there was a very popular autobiographical oral history of Daniel Boone. The book we see there on the right by Hugh Brackenridge was a satirical novel about the Whiskey Rebellion called Modern Chivalry. And it does kind of take a negative view on the crude frontiersman, but it's still about that American personality, that American character. Another popular type of writing of the time were what were called histories, and I'm using air quotes because these were not very accurate histories. Parson Weems himself, one of those book peddlers, almost immediately after Washington died, began selling this book, The Life of Washington. And it's the most popular history of the American Revolution, but a lot of it is fabricated. Like that story about George Washington cutting down a cherry tree when he was a kid. Not true, entirely made up by this man, Parson Weems. A more accurate history of the American Revolution was written by this woman, Mercy Otis Warren. And Mercy Otis Warren demonstrates another trend in literature at this time, and that is books for and books by women. That's a result of rising literacy rates among girls as girls begin entering common schools alongside boys. They're going to lag behind boys in terms of literacy rate, but they're closing the gap. Warren herself wrote propaganda during the American Revolution. She wrote poems and plays in support of the American Revolution. She also authored one of the Anti-Federalist Papers, calling for ratification of a Bill of Rights. Now, it wasn't revealed until well after her death that she was the author of that. She had to write it anonymously. But she also published the first complete history of the American Revolution. But because of the animosity between Federalists and Democratic Republicans, she had to wait. She was a Democratic Republican. She had to wait until Thomas Jefferson was in office to safely publish that book. We also have books like Susanna Haswell Rowson's Charlotte Temple about love and loss in the colonial era, and our first American feminist, Judith Sargent Murray, is published at this time. She herself was influenced by Mary Wollstonecraft, and she published her own essay on the equality of sexes in 1790.